Fellas, when was the UFC's best era? When it comes to the UFC's best era, there's always been a big debate. Some people think the old era of the UFC back in its early days was the best and new fans would have no idea. Some people think the modern era right now is the best because it's the most competitive and it's the most mainstream. So I'm going to be going through multiple different eras the UFC has gone through and kind of deciding which was the UFC's best era. When was the golden age of the UFC? When was it in its absolute peak? And we'll start off with the birth era, I like to call it, of the UFC in 1993 to 1999 when the UFC first kicked off. Now, this was really old, so old to the point where Dana White hadn't even been associated with the UFC at this moment in time. This was when you'd expect to see like 400-pound sumo wrestlers face random kickboxers that were half their weight. You'd see jiu-jitsu guys face boxers in an octagon. It'd be a bit all over the place. There was no rules, a lack of weight classes, and there was multiple fights per night. They'd fight in kind of like a tournament format, so you'd see like the same guys fighting in the same night. You could expect to see one guy fight 3 times. It was just a bit all over the place. You weren't really getting, obviously, like the MMA you see nowadays. It was kind of just a street fight that took place in an octagon. It was a bit all over the place, but it was fun to see. It's good to look back on kind of how crazy the UFC actually once was. UFC 12 was where we got the first bit of rules with the light heavyweight and the heavyweight division introduced. UFC 14 was when we finally got some gloves, and then UFC 15 was when they banged back at the headshots for obvious reasons. Some of the biggest pioneers at this moment in time was Royce Gracie. He basically dominated the UFC during this era from 1993 to 1995 onwards. He basically dominated him. He's one of the biggest pioneers for not only jiu-jitsu, but just MMA as a whole. He was kind of like the first big pioneer of the UFC. I mean, he fought on UFC's first event. Ken Shamrock, another big name. He did really well, dominated most of the MMA era at this moment in time, both in and outside the UFC. He was an absolute beast at the time as well compared to everybody else. Mark Coleman, first UFC heavyweight champion, an absolute beast in his prime as well. We also had Joe Rogan and Bruce Buffer out at this time, even before Dana White. And at this moment in time, UFC still wasn't the biggest MMA promotion. Pride FC was still bigger. That's where all the big fights were taking place. But the birth era, it was a bit all over the place. It's fun to look back on. It was the foundation of the UFC, though. This was where the UFC first started kicking off, pre-Dana White. And then we had the early 2000s era of the UFC from about 2000 to about 2006. And this is where the UFC really started to grow as a business. This is when Dana White came in and bought the UFC. And this is where UFC kind of went from the whole human cockfighting being associated with human cockfighting to being a legitimate sport with rules and regulations that could move on. And without Dana White, the UFC probably wouldn't have never got nowhere near as big as it is today. Maybe it wouldn't even be a thing anymore. They started banning headbutts, eye gouging, groin shots, which is, for obvious reasons. We also got some new weight classes with 155, 170, and 185 introduced. Some of the biggest stars at the time were Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Wanderlei Silva, Randy Couture, and Vitor Belfort. These were the main big stars at the time during this era. And there was a lot of good fights that took place. We had Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture, Matt Hughes versus BJ Penn, Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonner, which was a massive fight at the time. We also saw a lot of good debuts. GSP debuted during this time. BJ Penn debuted. Anderson Silva did. Rampage Jackson. They all debuted in the UFC during this era as well. So a lot of big stars came into the UFC. And obviously back then, well, nowadays we know we've got UFC fight nights and UFC pay-per-views, but back then they didn't have UFC fight nights. In fact, the frequency of the UFC events were kind of crazy. Like, for example, UFC 25 was in April, UFC 26 was in June, and UFC 27 was in September. So you can only imagine how many little events they did per year, considering they didn't even do fight nights. In fact, in 2000, there was only 6 UFC events the entire year. This was also the year when they introduced The Ultimate Fighter, which was obviously the reality TV show as well. And this is basically when the UFC really started to grow because of the purchase of Dana White. And this is when the UFC started to become a legitimate combat sports company that was starting to grow, starting to compete with the Pride FC. And yeah, this is when Dana White came in, and this is what kind of kicked off the growth of the UFC. And then we had the hardcore era, I like to call it, when a lot of hardcore fans became fans of the UFC, back from like 2007 to about 2010. Now, this is when most of the GOATs that we have in the UFC nowadays were in their prime. Anderson Silva was tearing up the middleweight division during this time, demolishing every middleweight, building a massive middleweight legacy that even today he still holds the crown for being the greatest middleweight of all time because of what he did during this era. GSP, the same thing, was dominating the welterweight division. Nobody could really touch him. He was pound for pound the best fighter in the world during this era, and there was a massive super fight in the talks between GSP and Silva, which even today I wish we got to see this fight, but we never did. BJ Penn was in his prime during this time as well, going out there just absolutely wrecking every single person he'd put his hands on. Lightweight champion, BJ Penn was in his prime, just smoking shocking people. John Jones debuted in the UFC at this moment in time, and he was just so far ahead of every light heavyweight, and people kind of knew early on in his career that he was going to be a future champion, and this is when he debuted during this era. We also saw Brock Lesnar come over to the UFC just during this period of time as well, beat Randy Couture to get the belt, defended against Frank Mir, and still to this day, one of the biggest heavyweights we've ever seen. He debuted in the UFC during this era. We got to see some big fights, a rematch between Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, Vanderlei Silva and Chuck Liddell, Frank Mir and Brock Lesnar, Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen in that massive rivalry. We also had the massive pay-per-view of UFC 100, which was kind of like the first big pay-per-view the UFC had, and it took place during this era. And the UFC kind of became a bit diverse during this era as well. This is where we started to see the UFC go to places like Australia, Abu Dhabi, Canada, and Germany for the first time. They started to go to different places. And we got some new weight classes with the bantamweight and the featherweight division, because obviously the UFC merged with WEC, which was essentially the UFC but for smaller weight classes. So the UFC just merged with WEC, got the bantamweight and the featherweight weight class. And we also got some more rules with a legitimate judging system in place and more controlling over the fouls that took place in the octagon. So the UFC, the hardcore era, this is where most of the stars and most of the GOATs that we have in the UFC were made. And this is when the sport became huge. It was rapidly growing as a combat sports company. And at this moment in time, it had overtaken Pride FC as the biggest MMA organization in the world. And then we have the UFC OG era, I like to call it, 2011 to 2015. Just after the hardcore era. This was when John Jones was in his prime. This is when he was absolutely tearing up the light heavyweight division, absolutely smoking everyone he'd go up there against. And this is when John Jones was doing his best work, like I said, in his prime. He had that big rivalry with DC take place during this era as well. And at this moment in time, most people were regarding him as the greatest of all time. We also got to see Demetrius Johnson, Dominic Cruz, and Jose Aldo come over to the UFC during this era. And obviously, those guys are the greatest in their weight class. So we saw 3 of the GOATs come over. And they had a lot of fun fights. Obviously, Demetrius Johnson wrecking the flyweight division. We had a massive fight between Dominic Cruz and TJ Dillashaw, another big rivalry. Women MMA, a new update just dropped. We had women MMA brought over to the UFC, and this is when Dana really started to make cash during this era. This is probably with Dana, this is when he probably got paid more than he's ever been paid before, because he got Ronda Rousey. And obviously, Ronda Rousey, the biggest women MMA star we've ever seen, started absolutely tearing up the women's divisions, going out there and smoking everyone, becoming a big star, until eventually she got knocked out by Holly Holm, but she still made the UFC a fuck ton of money. And obviously, the cash cow himself, Conor McGregor, came over to the UFC and just was tearing through every featherweight at the time. And even to this day, we've never really seen a featherweight like Conor McGregor with how slick he is on the feet. He was promoting fights perfectly. He was getting people interested in fights with his press conference antics. And then obviously the big fight with Jose Aldo for the belt builds up the fight perfectly, knocks him out in 13 seconds and generates him and the UFC a fuck ton of money and becomes the UFC's biggest star. And he still holds that crown to this day. I actually don't think anyone's going to be bigger than McGregor. And we also got to see some big fights. Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler #2, one of the greatest fights of all time. Junior Dos Santos versus Cain Velasquez. Anderson Silva ended up getting knocked out by Chris Weidman during this era. We saw a couple of big debuts. Cain Velasquez, Alexander Gustafsson, and Joanna Jędrzejczyk all debuted in the old ad. Cain Velasquez brought the UFC to Mexico. Joanna Jędrzejczyk went to Poland, didn't main event, but went to Poland, and then Alexander Gustafsson brought the UFC over to Sweden. And this was when USADA first entered the UFC as well, so the biggest drug testing agency first came to the UFC. We also saw the retirement of Rampage Jackson, Chuck Liddell, and GSP during this period of time as well. And I'd say the OG era of the UFC, 2011 to 2015, is where the UFC made superstars and superfighters. The UFC had some big stars before, but this is when the UFC really started to create some household names and some mainstream stars, some massive pay-per-views. This is when the UFC really started to get mainstream eyes on it, and they generated some superstars. And still to this day, they created some of the biggest superstars, bigger than most of today's as well, with the likes of McGregor and Rousey. And then we had the pre-COVID era of the UFC from 2016 to 2019, or what I like to call it, the golden age of the UFC. I think 2016 to 2019 was the UFC's golden age. This is where some of the biggest fights in UFC history took place. We had the 2 massive fights between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, which were huge fights. We had Conor McGregor move up and fight Eddie Alvarez, knock him out, and become the first ever simultaneous double champion in UFC history. And obviously, the big fight between Khabib and Conor McGregor, the biggest fight of all time, largely due to the build-up, the way they built the fight up, and then obviously the fight itself with Khabib submitting Conor McGregor. And Khabib himself already became a massive star during this period of time, because obviously he was a lightweight champion, beat Conor McGregor in the biggest fight ever, and then also beat Dustin Poirier during this era as well to become, in my opinion, the second biggest star in UFC history behind McGregor. We saw the biggest fight in women MMA history with Amanda Nunes taking on Ronda Rousey, where Ronda Rousey got absolutely destroyed. And then Amanda Nunes moved up a weight class to become the first ever simultaneous women's double champion, or just the first ever women's double champion ever, which was quite a big accomplishment. And in my opinion, still the greatest women MMA fighter of all time. John Jones was still clinging on to the light heavyweight division, maybe not as dominant, but he was still in the light heavyweight division, getting some big wins. He had that big rematch with DC as well. Like I said before, a massive rivalry. And DC himself, he was in his prime during this period as well. He was absolutely dominating the pre-COVID era of the UFC, going out there and dominating every single light heavyweight that he go out there against, ragdolling everyone. Then he comes up to the heavyweight division, beats Lewis, knocks out Stipe, becomes a double champion in the UFC simultaneously. And if we haven't had enough double champions during this period of time, Henry Cejudo wants to join the party, beats Demetrius Johnson for the flyweight belt, defends against Dillashaw, moves up and beats Moraes to become the double champion of the UFC. Simultaneously, as I've just said. We also had Michael Bisping knock out Luke Rockhold in a massive fight as well. And we also had the return of GSP, where he came back and choked out that same Michael Bisping to become, again, a champion, not simultaneous double champ, but a champion in a different weight class, and, you know, cement himself as one of the greatest of all time. And this is where we start to see the rise of Adesanya, Nate Diaz, and Jorge Masvidal for the first time. Adesanya was cruising through the UFC during this period of time, had that war with Kelvin Gastelum where he ended up winning by the skin of his teeth, and then knocks out Robert Whittaker to become the middleweight champion of the world. And then for Nate Diaz, obviously, those two big fights with Conor McGregor is kind of what made him the first guy to beat Conor McGregor in the UFC, and because of those McGregor fights, he himself has become a superstar, similar to what Khabib did. And then Jorge Masvidal, who might have had one of the best fights ever with 2019, started off the year by knocking out Darren Till brutally in enemy territory, then gets the fastest knockout in UFC history by knocking out Askren, who obviously got traded by Demetrius Johnson during this period of time, and then ended off the year by finishing Nate Diaz to become the BMF belt. One of the best years ever. Tony Ferguson was also on his winning streak at this moment in time. This was when we finally got to see the last glimpse of prime Tony Ferguson, and he would never win a fight again after this period of time. And Stipe Miocic became the greatest heavyweight of all time during this era as well, just dominating the heavyweight division. He was running through every single heavyweight like a hot knife through butter. This is where he built his heavyweight legacy, just beating absolutely everyone. Got the win back over DC as well, who was able to beat him as well. So this was Stipe's prime. We also got Dana White's Contender Series for the first time during this era, and there's been a lot of big stars from the UFC to come from Contender Series. It's still going on to this day. But I think this was the golden era purely because there was the biggest UFC stars of all time, the 4 double champs during this period of time, the biggest UFC pay-per-views of all time, and the biggest global expansion. So in my opinion, 2016 to 2019 was the golden age of the UFC. This is where the UFC became the biggest combat sports company in the world, bigger than any other combat sports company, just because of what they did in this time. So many superstars, so many super fights, it was just so consistent with so many big names during this period of time. And then we had the COVID era of the UFC from 2020 to 2021. Now, obviously, there's a lot of questions how the UFC were going to handle themselves when COVID was going around. We got the introduction of the UFC Apex, Abu Dhabi with Fight Island, where the UFC could bring some fighters that couldn't go to America to the UFC. And at first, it was a bit awkward because we were seeing these massive fights with absolutely no crowd, which we'd never seen before. But a lot happened during this period of time, a lot of big debuts. We saw Alex Pereira, Dricus du Plessis, Khamzat Chimaev, Tom Aspinall, and Ilia Topuria, some of today's biggest stars, debut during this period of time. We also saw a few big retirements. Khabib, one of the biggest stars of all time, retired during this period of time after beating Gaethje. Anderson Silva, after, staying in the UFC for a little bit too long, finally retired. We saw Henry Cejudo retire, but obviously, as we know now, that wasn't the case because he ended up coming back in the future. Adesanya was in his prime during this period of time, absolutely beat the crap out of Paulo Costa, moves up to attempt champ status against Jan Blachowicz, but falls short in quite a big fight during this period of time. Francis Ngannou makes a name for himself by brutally knocking out Stipe Miocic to become the heavyweight champion. Kamaru Usman was in his prime as well, dominating the welterweight division with some flash knockouts over Masvidal and Gilbert Burns. Charles Oliveira was on his title run during this period of time as well, finishing Michael Chandler to become the lightweight champion, submitting Justin Gaethje. Kevin Holland became a star this year as well. 5 wins in a single year, which is still crazy to even think. Kevin Holland became a big star. Nick Diaz came back to the UFC as well and had that big rematch with Robbie Lawler like 13 years after it happened. But yeah, there are a lot of big fights as well. I mean, we didn't only see McGregor come back once, not twice, but 3 times we saw McGregor compete during the COVID era. Obviously against Cerrone and then twice against Dustin Poirier. We also saw some other big pay-per-views with UFC 261 with Usman and Masvidal and UFC 268 with Usman and Covington. And we saw a lot of big moments. Buckley getting one of the greatest knockouts we've ever seen. Dustin Poirier knocking out Conor McGregor. Khabib submitting Justin Gaethje. Namajunas getting that KO over Wei Lee. Chandler debuting by knocking out Dan Hooker. Yuri Prochazka getting that brutal KO over Dominic Reyes. Brandon Moreno submitting Davison Figueiredo. A lot happened from 2020 to 2021 in the UFC. And it was the beginning of the modern era. Obviously, the modern era is completely different to what it was in the COVID era, but this is where we started to see some new familiar names that we still see nowadays. A lot of today's bigger stars came around during the COVID era of the UFC. So it was still impactful, and obviously that brings us to the modern era of the UFC right now. 2022 to 2024 is what I'd say is the modern era. I think this has just been filled up with what the fuck moments. I mean, Leon Edwards knocking out Kamaru Usman, Juliana Pena submitting Amanda Nunes, Sean Strickland dog-walking Israel Adesanya, Alexa Grasso submitting Valentina Shevchenko, Dricus du Plessis finishing Robert Whittaker, Sean O'Malley knocking out Aljamain Sterling, Izzy knocking out Alex Pereira, Ilia Topuria knocking out Volkanovski for the first time in Volkanovski's career, that big fight at UFC 300 between Max Holloway and Justin Gaethje. We also saw a lot of fighters from the previous eras kind of fall off. Usman went 0-3, is 0-3 during the modern era, Adesanya's 3-3, Masvidal's 0-2, Tony Ferguson's 0-5, and that's not even counting the COVID era as well. But we've also seen some big names come around. Alex Pereira has built his entire UFC career during the modern era. Obviously comes in the middleweight division, destroys Israel Adesanya for the belt, and then moves up to the light heavyweight division, and so far he's been in an absolute tear, just knocking everybody out. Islam Makhachev's become a star during this era by submitting Charles Oliveira and notably beating Volkanovski twice. Ilia Topuria's become a superstar, not only in just the modern era, but in just this year alone. I mean, knocking out Volkanovski and Holloway back-to-back is a massive achievement. We've also seen the rise of Tom Aspinall, Dricus du Plessis, Pantoja, Bilal Muhammad, and Sean Strickland during this era. Even when it comes to non-champions, we've seen a lot of big names. Chimaev, Shavkat, Paddy Pimblett, Bo Nickel, Diego Lopez have all built themselves up during the modern era. We've seen some pretty big pay-per-views. UFC 300 this year, which I think most would regard as the greatest UFC pay-per-view of all time, took place this year. UFC 276 was stacked, UFC 281 was stacked, UFC 291 was stacked as well. We saw some big super fights too. Makhachev versus Volkanovski, the best in the world, taking each other on. The return of John Jones when he fought Cyril Gane, and obviously we also saw John Jones return in the modern era when he comes back and beats Cyril Gane and fight Stipe Miocic for the heavyweight belt. Francis Ngannou, Robbie Lawler, Stipe Miocic, Amanda Nunes, Donald Cerrone, Korean Zombie, and Luke Rockhold will all retire or leave the UFC during this period of time as well. So we saw a lot of people end up leaving the UFC. It was weird for Jose Aldo because he left the UFC and also came back during the same era, because he left in 2022 and came back in 2024. And surprisingly, we saw some new rules in the modern era. You wouldn't expect to see new rules in 2024, but we have. Obviously, we've just recently seen the removal of the 12-6 elbow. We've seen the knees to ground and opponent rules change as well. We've seen some new golden gloves be implemented to the UFC for champions. And the UFC's become quite diverse. I mean, this year alone, we've gone to Saudi Arabia, China, London, or not London, but Manchester, Canada. We've been very diverse this year as the UFC. Now, I would say the modern era of the UFC is the new generation taking over the old generation. A lot of the older fighters, a lot of the legends you can say in the UFC have kind of been losing a lot recently, and I think the new generation is finally starting to take over. That is the highlight of the modern era. But to answer the question that this video's revolved about, what is the best era? If I've made it obvious already, I think the golden age of the UFC, 2016 to 2019, was when the UFC was in its peak. I mean, not only the super fights, but look at the names during this era as well. Conor McGregor, Stipe, Masvidal, Diaz, Cormier, Khabib, Nunes, GSP, Cejudo, Adesanya. Some of the all-time greats and some of the biggest stars of all time simultaneously were all competing during this period of time. And that is what, in my opinion, makes the UFC from 2016 to 2019, the pre-COVID era, the golden age of the UFC, and in my opinion, the UFC's best era. But let me know your thoughts on what you think the best era of the UFC has been. Do you agree with this or disagree? Let me know. Thank you for watching.